The power struggle in AI is moving outward. Not just into bigger models, but into media, interfaces, governance, infrastructure, and the physical systems that decide who gets to build at all. This week, you can see the stack hardening in real time. I'm Nova.
And I'm Alloy, and this is OpenClaw Daily. Today we've got 6 stories that all point at the same shift. OpenAI buys a media platform. Peter Steinberger highlights a workaround culture forming around Anthropic's restrictions. Microsoft launches an agent governance toolkit. Meta shows AI optimizing the machine layer itself. Microsoft commits $10 billion to AI infrastructure in Japan. And in the United States, the data center boom runs into an old-fashioned bottleneck, electricity. Let's get into it.
Today's episode is called the narrative layer, but honestly, it could just as easily be called the control layer. Because that's what these stories are really about. Who controls the story around AI? Who controls access to the best models? Who governs agents once they're running? Who gets to optimize the hardware underneath the stack? Who gets domestic compute? And who can actually get enough power onto a site to build any of this at scale?
And that matters because for a while the dominant AI conversation was incredibly model-centric. Which model is smarter? Which benchmark moved? Which chatbot sounds more natural? Which company won the week? Those stories still matter, obviously. But they are no longer sufficient. Because the economic structure of AI is getting more layered. The places where advantage compounds are no longer only in the model weights themselves. They're in the channels that frame the market, the interfaces that regulate usage, the governance systems that determine trust, the infrastructure optimizations that reduce cost, and the physical build-out that decides whether any of this can scale.
In other words, this is a week where AI stopped looking like a pure software race and started looking like a full-stack industrial contest. And those are different kinds of contests. Software races reward speed, iteration, feature velocity, and product intuition. Industrial contests reward planning, capital access, policy fluency, physical execution, and the ability to hold constraints in your head across years rather than days.
That's also why the stories this week feel less tidy than a normal product news roundup. They don't sit in one category. One story is media. One is user behavior under platform restrictions. One is governance architecture. One is low-level performance engineering. One is geopolitical placement. One is the power grid. But together they describe a maturing ecosystem. AI is becoming something that has to be administered, financed, housed, cooled, narrated, and politically justified.
And when that happens, people who only watch the surface miss the real action. So for this episode, we're going to stay with the stack. Not just what the products say they can do, but what the systems beneath them are telling us about where the industry is heading.
We start with OpenAI acquiring TBPN, the fast-rising live tech talk show and media brand that became a kind of daily briefing surface for builders, founders, operators, and the Silicon Valley attention economy. And this is one of those stories where the obvious reading is also the shallowest one.
The shallow reading is, okay, OpenAI bought a media property. Fine. Companies buy media assets. End of story. But that misses what TBPN actually was becoming. It wasn't just a show. It was a distribution node. It was a place where people who build products, raise money, and set narratives were already showing up every day. In a world where AI moves at network speed, owning a node like that is not peripheral. It's strategic.
OpenAI says editorial independence will remain intact, and maybe that's true in the operational sense. Maybe the hosts still book who they want, say what they want, argue the way they always have. But even if you grant the best-case version of that promise, the ownership shift still matters. Because the point isn't just editorial control in the narrow newsroom sense. The point is agenda setting. Proximity. Default framing. Which stories get oxygen first? Which executives become recurring voices? Which product launches feel central instead of optional?
And this is where the title "The Narrative Layer" starts to make sense. AI companies are no longer just fighting over model quality or benchmark scores. They are fighting over interpretation. If your company can't only ship the news but also host the conversation around the news, that changes your position in the ecosystem.
We've seen earlier versions of this pattern in tech. Platform companies become media adjacent. Venture firms launch podcasts. Founders become newsletter barons. But this feels more deliberate because the AI cycle is so compressed. When product cycles happen weekly and policy fights happen daily, controlling attention isn't vanity. It's infrastructure. And it matters specifically because so much AI understanding is socially mediated. Very few people read primary research papers, raw policy filings, and source repos all day. Most people encounter AI through interpreters, podcasters, newsletter writers, livestream hosts, YouTubers, analysts, venture people, journalists, and builders who summarize what matters. If you can influence the interpreter layer, you indirectly influence product perception, regulatory temperature, and investor sentiment all at once.
There's also a credibility paradox here. The more important AI becomes, the more demand there is for trusted interpreters who are close to the action but not fully captured by it. So if one of the most useful media surfaces gets bought by one of the central companies in the story, the natural question is whether that surface can still play the same role. That paradox is hard to solve because closeness creates access, and access creates value for the audience. But closeness also creates pressure. Maybe not explicit pressure. More often it's ambient. You know who signs the checks. You know who gets first briefings. You know which executives will or won't come back on the show. Those dynamics can shape tone long before they shape individual editorial decisions.
And that's why this is a bigger deal than corporate adjacency or founder vanity. OpenAI is extending vertically. Not just model provider. Not just product company. Not just enterprise vendor. Also a participant in the information environment that explains AI to the people building on top of it. There's a second-order effect too. Once a major AI lab starts buying distribution, every other lab has to consider whether leaving interpretation entirely to outsiders is strategically naive. Even if they don't buy a media property outright, they'll invest more in creator relations, briefing ecosystems, sponsored events, analyst influence, and executive visibility. So this kind of move can normalize a whole new layer of competition around narrative capture.
Put differently, if you own the model, the app, and a piece of the daily conversation, you don't just compete in the market. You help define what the market thinks is happening. Story 2 is the one Toby explicitly wanted in this episode, and rightly so, because it captures the ground truth of how technical communities react when a frontier lab tightens control. Peter Steinberger highlighted a workaround path using Claude Code and the CLI route around Anthropic's restrictions on OpenClaw-style usage. And whether you see that as clever, inevitable, or slightly hilarious, it's an important story.
Because the point is not just the tweet. The point is what the tweet represents. Anthropic tries to define a boundary. This kind of usage is in bounds, that kind is out of bounds, this belongs in first-party surfaces, this belongs under a different billing or policy regime. And almost immediately, the operator class starts looking for the seam.
That's what experienced builders do. They map the system as it actually exists, not as the product marketing page says it exists. If a lab creates a policy distinction between direct product usage and agent harness usage, the next question is naturally, okay, what pathways still exist? What interface surfaces remain open? What is technically allowed even if it's strategically discouraged?
And that makes this a bigger story than, haha, someone found a workaround. It's about the mismatch between how centralized labs want usage to happen and how power users actually work. Serious users do not want to live entirely inside a polished first-party chat box. They want terminals, scripts, schedulers, orchestration, local tooling, multiple agents, logs, recoverability, composability. They want to plug the model into a real workflow.
Which means anytime a lab says, implicitly or explicitly, please use the product the way we intended, the response from advanced users will be, we heard you, but we still need to get work done. That tension is now structural.
And it lands especially hard in the OpenClaw audience because OpenClaw sits exactly at that friction point. It is not just a chat interface. It's a runtime. A coordination layer. A way to put models inside actual operating loops. So when a frontier lab tightens the boundary around third-party harnesses, it doesn't just change price or policy. It sends a message about where agency is supposed to live.
Inside their walls, preferably.
Right. Inside their walls, on their UX, on their terms, with their telemetry, with their limits, and often with their billing logic. But the Peter Steinberger story is what happens when that preference hits reality. The CLI remains a pressure release valve. The terminal remains the place where determined users regain control. There's also a cultural layer here. The CLI has always represented something in computing beyond efficiency. It signals directness, legibility, agency. If a GUI is a guided path, the CLI is negotiated freedom. You can chain tools, redirect output, script around omissions, do things product teams didn't prioritize. That's exactly why the terminal keeps resurfacing in every wave of software centralization. And for experienced developers, the command line is not some nostalgic preference. It is the place where abstractions become inspectable. You can see stare. You can see logs. You can run one model through another tool. You can preserve artifacts. You can recover from failure without waiting for a product team to add a button. That flexibility is especially valuable in agent workflows because agent workflows are messy by nature. They branch, retry, fail, resume, and touch multiple systems.
So in one sense, this is an Anthropic story. In another sense, it's an old computing story wearing AI clothes. Vendors centralize. Users root around. The stack gets more locked down. The command line gets more important again. And that's why this belongs in EP024 even if it started as a single tweet-sized moment. It's a tiny window into a much bigger argument about where power should live. With the lab. With the product surface. Or with the user sitting at a terminal who wants to compose their own system from parts. That argument is not going away. It also hints at what the next few years may look like for frontier model vendors. If they keep trying to steer users back into first-party environments, users will increasingly bifurcate. Mainstream users will stay inside the official product, because convenience wins. Advanced users will build around the edges, because leverage wins. That split could shape pricing, policy, and product design much more than current subscription categories suggest. And for the episode's broader theme, this is the interface control story in its most practical form. Not press releases. Not legal frameworks. Just one blunt question. When the platform owner says no, where are the remaining doors?
Story 3 moves us from access control to runtime control. Microsoft launched the Agent Governance Toolkit, an open-source toolkit focused on runtime security and governance for autonomous agents. And while that sounds a little dry on first read, I actually think this is one of the most important stories of the week.
Same. Because it reflects a maturity shift in enterprise AI. Early on, the dominant question was, can agents do useful things? Can they browse? Call APIs? Write code? Pull data? Complete tasks? That phase was capability first. The new question is, once they can do those things, how do you contain them, observe them, authorize them, and stop them?
Exactly. Governance is what shows up the moment an AI system stops being a demo and starts becoming load-bearing. The toolkit includes things like policy enforcement, identity and trust layers, execution controls, kill switches, compliance mapping, and integrations with common agent frameworks. None of that is sexy in the consumer demo sense. All of it is what serious organizations eventually need.
Put simply, an agent that can do things in the world also needs a perimeter. It needs a record of what it attempted, what it touched, what privileges it had, And what happens if it goes off the rails or even just behaves ambiguously? In that sense, the evolution path for agents starts to look less like chatbots and more like distributed systems, security infrastructure, and operating environments.
The phrase I keep coming back to is operational governance. Prompt safety is part of the story, sure. But prompt safety is upstream. Runtime governance is downstream. And downstream is where damage or value actually happens.
Think about a simple enterprise use case. An agent triages tickets, queries internal systems, drafts responses, maybe opens or closes service workflows, maybe triggers a vendor action. Once that's real, you need to know not only whether the model is polite and aligned, but whether the action layer is bounded. Which systems can it reach? Under whose identity? With what approvals? What logging? What rollback path?
And Microsoft is well positioned for this because they understand institutional gravity. Big companies don't only buy capability. They buy control surfaces. They buy the answer to what happens when legal asks, and what happens when the CISO asks, and what happens when this agent touches a regulated workflow.
So the deeper signal here is that enterprise AI is moving from experimentation into governance architecture. And once that happens, the winners aren't only the model vendors. The winners are also the companies that define the trust fabric around agents. And trust fabric is exactly the right phrase, because governance is not one feature. It's a mesh. Identity, authorization, logging, oversight, escalation, rollback, policy mapping, secrets handling, environmental boundaries, all of those things have to cooperate if an organization is going to feel comfortable letting an agent touch something important. You don't get enterprise trust by saying the model is pretty good. You get it by making the whole action path auditable.
Which is why a toolkit like this may end up matching more than a dozen flashy assistant launches. Big organizations can tolerate missing a fad. They cannot tolerate unbounded action. The absence of governance is often the real blocker to deployment, even when the models are already good enough. So when Microsoft productizes governance language and patterns, it is addressing the brake pedal, not just the accelerator. Also worth noting, making this open source is strategic. It lets Microsoft shape the vocabulary and architecture of agent governance beyond its own products. If developers and enterprises start adopting Microsoft's framing for policy interception, identity, trust, and execution rings, then Microsoft becomes influential at the standard-setting layer even where it doesn't own the whole stack. This is how platform power often spreads in enterprise technology. First you sell products. Then you publish patterns. Then your patterns become defaults. Then everyone else has to explain themselves in your language. If that happens in agent governance, Microsoft ends up with influence far beyond direct product usage.
Which is a recurring theme in AI right now. Companies don't only want product share. They want conceptual share. They want the world to adopt their abstractions.
So yes, this is a toolkit launch. But more importantly, it's a sign that we've entered the phase where autonomous agent is no longer a magic phrase. It's a governance problem. And governance problems create entire software categories.
Story 4 is Meta's Kernel Evolve, and this one is catnip for anyone who thinks the most interesting AI stories are no longer happening at the chatbot layer. Kernel Evolve is an agentic system designed to write and optimize low-level kernels across different hardware environments, with Meta reporting significant throughput gains, including notable improvements for production inference workloads.
This is one of my favorite kinds of AI story because it cuts through the AI writes an email discourse and drops us into the machine room. Kernels are not flashy. They are not consumer-facing. But they sit in the performance path. If you can improve them materially, you change the economics of real workloads.
And that matters because the hyperscaler AI race isn't just about who has the smartest model. It's also about who gets more useful work out of the same silicon. If an agentic optimization system can squeeze major efficiency gains from production stacks, then AI is no longer only a user layer tool. It becomes a systems engineering multiplier.
Which, frankly, is where a lot of the real moat may live. Frontier models get commoditized downward over time. product wrappers get copied. But hard-won systems optimization at scale, especially optimization that compounds across fleets of GPUs, CPUs, custom accelerators, and internal software stacks, that becomes very difficult to replicate quickly.
There's a conceptual shift here too. For years, a lot of mainstream AI coverage implicitly assumed that AI sits above infrastructure. It consumes compute. It uses hardware. It runs on the substrate. What kernel evolve suggests is a feedback loop where AI also starts shaping the substrate.
That matters economically because every percentage point of efficiency at hyperscale gets multiplied by absurd volumes. If you shave cost, memory pressure, or inference latency across major production workloads, you are not just winning an engineering contest. You are improving the business case for the entire platform. Better kernels can mean lower serving cost, higher throughput, better utilization, and faster product iteration because the economics loosen up.
The phrase AI optimizing AI infrastructure sounds recursive because it is recursive. But recursion is exactly the point. Once you have enough capability to attack the bottlenecks inside the stack, the system starts improving its own foundations.
And no, that doesn't mean magical runaway self-improvement tomorrow. Let's stay sane. It means something more grounded and probably more consequential in the short term. Engineering teams get a new kind of tool that helps them search optimization space faster than they could manually.
Right. Instead of waiting weeks for an elite specialist to test hand-tuned variations, the system can explore candidate kernels, benchmark them, reject bad ones, and surface better performing options on a much tighter loop. That is not sci-fi. That is applied performance engineering with an agentic accelerator.
Also, think about labor implications at the high end. This isn't replacing generic office tasks. It's augmenting extremely specialized low-level engineering work. That tells you something important about where advanced AI is already credible.
And it ties back to the broader stack war. OpenAI buys narrative. Anthropic fights for interface control. Microsoft builds governance. Meta dives below the app layer and optimizes the machine room. Everyone is grabbing a different stratum of the stack.
Which means the competition is no longer cleanly model versus model. It's layer versus layer. Whoever builds the strongest stack position may not be the company with the flashiest chat demo. And that may be one of the least appreciated transitions in AI right now. The public still tends to score the race through visible products and benchmark drama. But large companies often win through operational depth that outsiders barely notice: lower cost per token, better hardware utilization, tighter internal tooling, stronger deployment velocity, and better reliability under production load. Kernel Evolve is a reminder that some of the most valuable AI progress is almost invisible unless you know where to look. Story 5 takes us from machine room optimization to geopolitical placement. Microsoft announced a $10 billion investment in Japan spanning AI infrastructure, cybersecurity, and workforce training. And this is one of those stories that's easy to flatten into big tech invests abroad, but there's more going on here.
The keyword is sovereignty. AI infrastructure is increasingly being sold not just as cloud capacity, but as a sovereignty-sensitive service. Governments and major enterprises want to know where data lives, who operates the infrastructure, how policy compliance works, what legal regime applies, and whether domestic institutions get meaningful participation.
In other words, we have GPUs is no longer the whole pitch. The pitch is now, we can give you compute on terms that feel nationally legible. Local infrastructure. Local collaboration. Local security posture. Local labor investment. Trust becomes part of the product.
Microsoft has been particularly good at this style of enterprise statecraft. They know how to speak the language of institutions. So a $10 billion Japan commitment isn't just a capacity expansion. It's a message. Microsoft wants to be the trusted geopolitical cloud for countries that want AI capability without feeling fully dependent on a distant black box.
And Japan is a meaningful place to make that case. It's a major industrial economy, strategically important, deeply attuned to resilience and security, and serious about digital competitiveness. A deal like this is not just regional expansion. It's a template demonstration.
There's also a workforce angle that matters. The AI conversation often over-focuses on models and under-focuses on institutional absorption. You can't just drop massive compute into a region and assume value appears. You need skilled operators, security capacity, integration talent, and organizations ready to use the infrastructure. This is one reason infrastructure announcements can sound bigger than they initially behave. Hardware alone does not create adoption. Institutions need time and talent to metabolize it. They need procurement structures, compliance processes, internal champions, technical translators, and enough confidence that the system won't create more organizational chaos than value. So when Microsoft talks about training alongside infrastructure, that's not decorative. It's part of the mechanism.
Which is why the workforce training component matters just as much as the CAPEX headline. If AI infrastructure is becoming national infrastructure, then the labor base around it becomes part of the strategic asset.
And zooming out, this story pairs neatly with the power grid story we'll hit next. Compute is not purely virtual. It lands somewhere. It gets negotiated somewhere. It consumes resources somewhere. It has politics somewhere.
So if the old cloud era was about scale and convenience, this phase looks more like location, legitimacy, and alignment with national priorities. AI infrastructure is becoming geopolitics with service-level agreements. And once that becomes normal, every major cloud provider has to answer a new class of questions. Not just how much capacity can you sell, but how credibly can you localize it? How do you reassure governments that you are a partner rather than a dependency risk? How do you make your stack feel national enough to trust while still benefiting from global scale? Those questions sit at the center of the next infrastructure cycle.
Final story, the physical reality check. A new report says roughly half of planned US data center builds have been delayed or cancelled because of shortages in power infrastructure and key components. And honestly, this may be the most clarifying story in the whole episode.
Because it reminds everyone that the AI boom is still made out of boring stuff. Steel. Concrete. Switchgear. Transformers. Cooling systems. Transmission capacity. Interconnection queues. Land. Permitting. Construction labor. You can say infinite scale in a keynote, but the grid still gets a vote.
This is the part of the AI story that has no interest in hype cycles. If a site can't get enough power, it doesn't matter how strong demand is. If a transformer lead time is brutal, it doesn't matter how many GPUs you've budgeted. If substations and lines can't support the load, the build slips.
And what's fascinating is how quickly the AI discourse has been forced down from abstraction into infrastructure realism. For a while, the public conversation could pretend compute was just a cloud menu item. Now everyone is rediscovering that cloud means buildings and electricity somewhere.
Which also reshapes competitive advantage. A company that can secure long-term power contracts, navigate utility relationships, and lock in scarce electrical equipment may gain more real leverage than a company with a marginal benchmark edge.
This is where the phrase bottleneck becomes literal. The constraint is not metaphorical. It is amperage, equipment, and timetable. And once that happens, the AI race starts to resemble older industrial races more than consumer software races. And that resemblance matters because industrial races produce different winners than app races. In app races, a clever startup can sometimes jump the queue with better execution. In industrial races, incumbency, capital access, supply chain relationships, and regulatory fluency start to matter much more. The field consolidates around whoever can actually secure scarce inputs.
There's also a strategic vulnerability dimension. If half of planned builds are delayed or cancelled, then the market is not just supply constrained. It becomes allocation constrained. Which projects get built? Which customers get priority? Which regions move first? Those are political economy questions, not just technical ones.
And the supply chain piece matters too. If critical components are scarce or tied up in geopolitical tension, then AI build-out inherits the fragility of global industrial systems. That's a very different world from the fantasy where the cloud simply scales because demand exists.
So this is the story that grounds everything else we covered. OpenAI can buy narrative. Operators can route around interface restrictions. Microsoft can govern agents. Meta can optimize kernels. Microsoft can place sovereign-friendly infrastructure in Japan. But underneath all of it sits the oldest truth in technology. If the physical substrate can't expand, the software dreams back up behind it.
So let's pull the thread tight. OpenAI buys a media node because controlling the conversation matters. Peter Steinberger's workaround story shows that users fight back when platforms try to overcontrol the interface. Microsoft launches governance tooling because agents are leaving the demo phase and entering the compliance phase. Meta uses AI to optimize infrastructure itself. Microsoft sells AI capacity in sovereignty-aware form. And the US build-out runs headfirst into power constraints.
6 stories, 1 stack. Narrative. Interface. Governance. Machine layer. National placement. Physical limits. That's the map now.
And what makes this week interesting is that none of these stories live in isolation. They reinforce each other. The more valuable AI becomes, the more companies want to control access. The more access gets controlled, the more users seek open seams. The more agents do real work, the more governance becomes mandatory. The more valuable inference is, the more optimization moves down the stack. The more strategic the stack becomes, the more governments care where it lives. And the more everyone tries to build, the more the grid reminds them that reality is not a press release. That feedback loop is probably the real headline of the week. Every layer is reacting to every other layer. Corporate strategy shapes user behavior. User behavior pressures platform policy. Platform policy increases the value of governance. Governance increases the value of infrastructure predictability. Infrastructure bottlenecks increase the value of optimization. And optimization increases the stakes of controlling access to the systems being optimized. Nothing here is isolated anymore.
That's the narrative layer in 2026. Not just who tells the story, but who gets to shape every interface around the story, and who has the infrastructure underneath to make their version of the future feel inevitable. And maybe the simplest way to say it is this: AI is becoming normal in the oldest possible sense. It is becoming something institutions want to own, root, constrain, finance, narrate, and physically anchor. Once that happens, the romance of the pure breakthrough gives way to the politics of systems. That doesn't make the technology less interesting. If anything, it makes it more consequential.
Because once a technology becomes infrastructural, the winners are not chosen only by brilliance. They're chosen by control, staying power, logistics, and who can keep the whole thing legible under pressure. That's what this week looked like. Not one giant breakthrough. A series of moves that make the stack harder, heavier, and more real. And that's probably the right note to end on. If you're following AI casually, the temptation is to look for a single headline company or a single breakthrough model and call that the whole story. But the more useful way to read this moment is as a contest over coordination. Who can coordinate media, users, policy, tooling, hardware, capital, and energy into one durable system? That is a much bigger challenge than shipping a clever chatbot. Full show notes and links from today's episode are at tobionfitnesstech.com/podcasts. And if you've been feeling like the AI story is getting less about singular model releases and more about system control, you're not imagining it. That's exactly where we are.
Thanks for listening. I'm Nova.
And I'm Alloy. We'll be back soon.